This is JP Hampstead, editorial director here at FreightWaves, and I'm with Don Mabry, the SVP of Global Trade Solutions at Infios. Don, how are you today?
I'm doing terrific. Thank you so much.
Would you mind telling us a little bit about Infios and what you do there?
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to speak with you today about this rise of the tariff optimized supply chain report, and particularly about how our findings are relevant to all companies that are importing goods and materials in the United States. So, yeah, I'm the vice president of global trade solutions at Infios. And so, in this role, it's a privilege to be involved at that intersection between how this regulatory environment and landscape is directly impacting how our customers are operating and adapting to ever changing conditions. And more importantly, how intelligent supply chain execution technology offers a path forward for these companies.
In the white paper, the rise of the tariff optimized supply chain, it describes tariff exposure being treated almost as like a live variable, kind of on par with freight costs and lead time and service levels. Can you tell us a little bit about what this new operating model looks like in practice and how it differs kind of from the way companies manage their supply chains before?
Oh, absolutely. So, the simplest way to put it is what started back with China back in 2018, has by 2025, it fundamentally rewired how supply chains operate. And the reason that that matters is this reason isn't just another tariff conversation. It's that we saw in 2025, it wasn't just a policy adjustment. It was really where this tariff stacking introduced a structural break in how trade costs of these importers today. And so we saw things like this 35 to 50% duty bracket grow tenfold. And so the 50% plus bracket went from effectively zero to tens of thousands of entries. And that's a different cost environment if you think about it, full stop. So in the old model, tariffs were treated as a fixed cost and that companies absorb them. And then you had mode selection, entry structuring, even where you warehouse. All those were operational and financial decisions where tariffs set over to the side. They're sort of quietly in the background and they were a P&L item. But in this tariff optimized supply chain, everything gets flipped. And so now your tariff exposure is a live execution variable, as you mentioned. So it's managed alongside other important things like freight costs, service level, and lead time. And what that looks like in practice for companies that they're actively engineering that duty exposure, of course, within applicable laws and regulation, but they're also using things like HTS classification strategies, qualifying their origins, using bonded warehouse staging, selective inventory withdrawals, and things like pull forward of this low duty SKUs, and then ensuring that it's all encompassed in their landed cost scenario modeling. And so in the report, you'll see where they don't, we put out the line that they don't accept the duty bill, they design around it. And so what we found too, though, is there's a contrast with that what we'll call the pre-tariff era. And it's very sharp in three places. So first, that mode selection, it used to be about cost and service decisions. But under this sustained tariff pressure, the data shows importers are making choices sort of in an aggregate. It reflects a greater emphasis on speed, control, and financial exposure at that entry level of those goods. So nobody used to pick up a shipping mode with that tariff risk in mind, and figure out how they wanted to ship those goods. But now they do. Secondly, planning used to start near zero for these duties. And so times have changed so much. Now companies, they're already baking in like a 10 or a 20% baseline assumption into the landed cost scenarios from the onset. So that's a big dramatic change. And then third, compliance moved from this, we'll say, a checkpoint at the end of the process. Did you do everything like you were supposed to? But now it's a strategic lever. So it's actively shaping which routes, modes, and even the structures of those entries to make sure that you stay viable as you're importing those goods. And then lastly, underneath all of that, there's this deeper shift and tension where traditional supply chains, they were linear systems that were built for stability. But the tariff optimized supply chain, it's adaptive and it's built for change. That's the real distinction here. And that's the operating model the data is pointing us toward today.
That's fascinating. I completely agree that like it's not just that tariffs, there are more commodities being exposed to higher tariffs, but it's also the speed at which the tariff regime has changed. It's the purpose that the tariffs are being used for, and all of those factors kind of introducing new complexities and things for importers to deal with. The white paper identified some really interesting sort of responses on the part of shippers and importers to the tariffs. You guys identified like a sort of a clear wave one kind of reactive surge, a classic kind of pull forward that happened in the summer of 2025, last summer. And then now you're saying it was kind of followed by a wave two. You called it a structural adaptation that really was sort of after that summer, fall, winter, leading into 2026. Um, what behavioral shifts have proven most durable, and what do those changes tell us about how importers have re-engineered their supply chains?
Yeah, that's a very intriguing question. So okay, so wave one, it was a pure reaction to that pressure that was being put on the marketplace, and we found that the clearest tell in our findings was that the U.S. to Mexico to Canadian surge benefited from preferential trade treatments, and that's where we found that Mexico's origin share jumped over 5% and Canada rose by 5%. However, by the second half of the year, both gains had roughly halved. So that wasn't resourcing. That was really panic driven route testing. We also saw experimental corridors like things like Vietnam to Ethiopia and Ireland to Switzerland. These appeared suddenly. And so that 50% plus duty bracket, it spiked before it settled. And then air and truck share jumped because the urgency was overriding any type of cost discipline that these importers had. And here's one of the most striking single numbers I'll share with you in the data set. When de minimis was removed, the Canadian informal entries, they jumped by 79%, and that was literally overnight. So they went from like 34,000 to 61,000. And that's the signature of a cost environment that is changing faster than any planning cycle could absorb. But let's get back to wave two, because that's where that real story sits. And so several shifts didn't unwind, and those are the ones that have long-term significance. So China's loss of that origin share, so it's down about 3 percentage points across that full period. It held. The modal shifts also held. So we found things like air was up 12 points, truck was up 8, ocean down 10 to 12, but none of that reversed. Then we had bonded warehouse usages. It went from around 10% of entries to as high as 18%. And it kept climbing into the second half rather than peaking and fading. And so HTS classification complexity, it nearly doubled. And this is where that sequence counts for each product item per entry. It moved from around 6 to 12. And it stayed there. They didn't get removed back off. And so it's still very heavy with those sequences. And the total entered value, though, of those goods, it rose roughly 78%, while entry counts actually fell 7%. What does that mean? Well, that means that importers were consolidating into fewer, higher value shipments. They weren't simply shipping less. Now, I want to be careful here. We're not claiming companies optimized their tariff position back in 2025. Our report is explicit on this. What the data captures is the early stages of active management. We've got true optimization. That still lies ahead. That's where we're going. So the story isn't that supply chains pivoted. It's that they really had to iterate under this pressure that came out of nowhere. And the durable changes were execution changes. That's the takeaway. The shifts that held, they're not sourcing decisions, they're execution decisions. So things like smarter classification, deliberate mode selection, phased duty exposure, more adaptive routing. And critically, those capabilities aren't dependent on any single policy outcome. They're
Mhm.
mechanisms for operating under uncertainty. And that's why they've persisted into 2026 and we're still all dealing with them today. And that's why we believe they're becoming the new baseline rather than some passing response that people had to adapt to.
Yeah, I really appreciate how you talk about the fact that it was a change in like execution processes and decisions rather than sourcing. The tariffs created so much uncertainty, and we saw corporate capex suppressed so much in the United States that it was hard to imagine that companies were confidently building factories in foreign countries based on the sort of the volatile political environment in Washington D.C. Um, so that's really helpful. I want to dig into what you said about the bonded warehouse entries because you know we obviously track the freight markets and supply chains and freight flows really closely, and it's always fun to see people rushing to import stuff and then kind of figuring out where it's going to go and where they're going to stage it and where they're going to store it. You cited bonded warehouse entries rising from around 10% to 16 to 18%, and kind of the strategic use of duty deferrals and selective withdrawals and landed cost scenario modeling. Can you tell me a little bit about how kind of the more sophisticated importers are now treating duties as like a treasury and cash flow tool rather than just a fixed cost?
Absolutely. So here that that shift, it's fundamental. And so when those effective duty rates rose into that 20 and upwards to almost 80% plus range for certain categories, again driven by that tariff stacking, this is a structural break. It's not a one-off. Those cash flow implications, they got dramatic. So, consider something like a single 40-foot container of like mid-range electronics. They could carry duties in hundreds of thousands of dollars. At that level, duties stop being really a P&L line item. Instead, they really start being a treasury question to deal with. And that bonded warehousing in particular, it became this pressure release valve. So the data shows it moving from this niche tool used by a handful of industries to a real mainstream strategy almost overnight. So utilization went from, as you mentioned, from roughly 10% up to as high as 18%. And it kept climbing though through this second wave. So what we found was there were basically three mechanisms that sophisticated importers are using now and today. First, that deferred duty payment. That's where duty only becomes payable when those goods are withdrawn from U.S. consumption. So importers can do things like preserve their liquidity. They can align duty costs with the actual sales velocity of their goods and avoid paying tariffs on that inventory that may not move quickly. For seasonal businesses or even volatile demand profiles that are out there, the cash flow impact on these can be very significant. And the second area that we found was protection against mid-course policy changes was really important. So goods sitting in bond can, depending on things like timing and classification, they can be insulated from those tariff increases that take effect while they're in storage. So in an environment where rates were moving faster than the shipments could even clear, that provided real protection for those that are able to take advantage of that. And then third, selective withdrawal of those goods, and specifically as importers got more comfortable. The data suggests they started using bonds very tactically. They're pulling forward lower duty items and then deferring higher duty ones. And then they're batching those withdrawals as they're being brought over into consumption to reduce administrative load because they're under pressure there too. So The honest read, though, and I think the report is real clear about this, and that's why it's exciting, was in 2025 was the early stages of this active management, but it wasn't optimization. And so aligning duty payment, those timing to sales velocity that's informed by this financial modeling, it really requires a level of automation and overall execution intelligence that most organizations, they're just now getting their arms around. The first phase was very rapid and reactive. This next phase, though, we're heading into will be much more deliberate and insight driven. But the underlying principle that's already taking hold that we see is leading companies, they're no longer treating duties as this fixed static cost. They're actively managing their exposure to those duties within the bounds of applicable laws and regulations. They're using available programs and timing strategies and operational levers. What are they trying to do? They're trying to improve efficiency and financial outcomes. That candidly is the conversation that finance oriented buyers they want to be having and we're having with them today. And it's what the data shows, it's just beginning to scale.
That's fascinating. I mean, we've been talking a lot about sophisticated importers and how they're sort of actively managing their tariff exposure. I think we should talk a little bit about, what it takes for companies to be able to do that. I mean, on the one hand, we've got HTS, classification complexity roughly doubling. Uh, Even the sort of the choice of your transportation mode has now become a tariff risk decision in many cases.
Sure.
And intelligence into routing and the implications for lead times, velocity, costs, tariff exposure. That intelligence has become a strategic warning system. So what does it take to actively manage your tariff exposure in the way that we're talking about? What capabilities do you think that companies must build or partner to access to compete effectively in this new era?
Oh, yes. Look, the core message of the report is that traditional systems were not designed for this environment. Traditional TMS platforms, they optimize for cost and delivery and don't really have a concept of tariff exposures. ERP systems, they plan on cycles that are way too slow for even a weekly or even a daily policy change. It would overwhelm it. Then you've got your brokerage workflows. What are they leaning on? Manual processes that simply can't handle the HCS volume or even the withdrawal filings that they're having to do. Then you got visibility platforms. They can tell you something went wrong, but not what to do about it. And then procurement tools. They evaluate those suppliers by the location, but that's not at an execution pathway level that determine that landed cost. So that gap, it's real and it's starting to show up in financial results. So from our report analysis, 6 capabilities stood out as being essential. One was dynamic tariff modeling. So running scenarios across stacked tariff layers and ability to compare real landed costs across execution paths before the organization commits. Then a second one was intelligent classification and origin management. That's where you're automating this HTS assignment recommendations. You're also doing things like digital document extraction, rules of origin mapping, and all of that has to be kept audit ready at all times. And that's what's critical. And then third, we have multimodal execution decisioning. This is like where you're choosing between ocean, truck, and air based on tariff exposure, lead time, risk. So all of those things, not just cost. And then 4 is warehouse entry and withdrawal optimization. That's where your modeling of the duty deferral scenarios and managed bonded inventory is very important to be done in an intelligent way. And then the 5th one we found was route and corridor intelligence. So tracking emerging corridors, spot those collapsing flows, and identify enforcement sensitive routes before they become a liability. Because that's the little, it's too late to react then. And then 6, this automated compliance orchestration. So enabling of that digital backbone that scales with filing volume and handles withdrawals and these low value entries without it all breaking. And that compliance piece, I'll call it out a little further because it's important. I just want to make sure that it's clear. In the report, we describe compliance as this connective tissue. So it's not a standalone theme. It's structurally what makes everything else possible. So mode shifts only hold if origin documentation supports the entry. Duty deferral only works if your classification is accurate. And then route intelligence, it's only actionable if the rules of origin discipline is maintained. So when you're building this stack, compliance isn't a constraint, it's the enabler of what's going on. So the framing we landed on, as you'll see in the report, is optionality is the new efficiency. So traditional supply chains, they were built to be efficient. Tariff era supply chains, they have to be flexible and efficient, offering multiple modes available to choose from, multiple origins that have been qualified, multiple entry strategies that are ready, multiple routing options all on the table. Not because you use all of them at once, but because when policy shifts, you need to move fast. So whether companies build that themselves or partner to access it, that's the bar that we have found to be very clear.
That's great. I want to dig into a little bit about what you said about the digital backbone, Don. I've covered freight tech for I think 8 years at this point, and 5 years ago, call it, you would often hear from supply chain practitioners that they were drowning in data, that they were overwhelmed, that they had so many different software platforms reporting so many different things to them, but it was disconnected, it was siloed. Just gathering it and compiling it was like several FTEs jobs, right? And the report I think makes clear that traditional supply chain infrastructure, transportation management systems, enterprise resource planning, brokerage workflows, and even visibility platforms weren't really designed for this tariff environment. And but now automation and the way you put it, execution intelligence are really table stakes. Um, there has been a new technology though that has proven itself to be able to chew through huge amounts of data looking for patterns very quickly. And I'm talking, of course, about AI, and whether it's generative or agentic. Can you tell us about sort of how you see AI accelerating the move to a true tariff optimized supply chain?
Absolutely. So, let's recap. So, what the data has told us, HCS sequence counts, they nearly double. They're going from about 6 to 12 per entry. So then withdrawal filings, they're up sharply. Classification now is to count for these stacked tariffs. Origin qualification has to stay in this, what we'll call an audit ready state across hundreds of suppliers and thousands of shipments. The report is direct on what we found. Manual validation at this scale is no longer feasible, and that companies will need to invest in AI assisted classification, automated tooling to avoid falling behind. And that's the gap that we find. And that's exactly where agentic and generative AI come in. And so, like generative AI, it takes on the whole language and document side of this whole problem that we're talking about. So you've got this unstructured content around things like business artifacts, commercial invoices, supplier certifications. Let's see what else comes to mind. Country of origin documentation, broker correspondence, policy updates. That used to be the manual bottleneck. But here, generative models can extract and normalize that content, process and reason over it, and then draft compliance narratives, summarize landed cost scenarios, all for, let's say, executive review, then translate that so those tariff changes that might land on that Tuesday morning into something a planner can act on by lunch that day. So it collapses the time between a policy shift that happens and then the operational response that's needed by the organization. But it doesn't stop there. And so agentic AI takes it that next step. It's where generative AI explains and drafts, but agentic AI decides and executes inside the guardrails of what this company sets, of course. So picture it where agents are continuously running those 6 capabilities that the report called out. Things like monitoring tariff layers, rerunning landed cost scenarios in real time, assigning HTS codes, flagging origin qualification risk before a filing goes out, recommending a mode change when that duty math on a lane shifts, maybe scheduling bonded withdrawals against an actual sales velocity on how the results are coming back in from the organization. And then watching trade route signals to flag collapsing corridors before they become a liability to the organization. So today, most of that work sits across these siloed tools with human handoffs in between. But agents can stitch that into a single workflow. And it isn't about bolting AI onto some legacy stack. It's really about unified execution as a layer where this intelligence runs through the workflow itself. We've got classification, mode selection, that's the entry structuring, withdrawal timing, route monitoring, all operating as one adaptive system. And that's where the report means when we say optionality is the new efficiency. You can't keep multiple modes, multiple origins, and multiple entry strategies genuinely live at the ready without intelligence orchestration between them. So generative AI gives you that comprehension that you need, and then agentic AI gives you the execution. So together, they turn this tariff-optimized supply chain from a thesis into something companies can actually operate against at scale. And that's our vision at Infios with an exciting capability we call Archer. That it's really transforming how companies are leveraging intelligent supply chain execution today.
Don, thanks so much for joining me today and telling us about Infios's truly fascinating findings about how importers and shippers are dealing with a completely new tariff regime.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.